Imagine writing a biography of someone 40 years after they died, from memory. The earliest Gospel, Mark, wasn't written until approximately 65 to 70 AD, nearly 4 decades after the crucifixion. Matthew and Luke followed around 80 to 90 AD. John came last, around 90 to 110 AD. According to New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina, none of these texts were written by eyewitnesses. By the time Penn met Papyrus, the people who actually knew Jesus were almost certainly dead. 40 years. That's not journalism. That's legend territory. History is complicated. Faith is personal. But the evidence deserves an honest look. What if the most read book in human history was also one of the least verified? 4 books. Billions of believers. But when historians, not atheists, not priests, when historians put the Gospels under the microscope, what they find is complicated. The most influential documents in Western history were written by no one. Here's a fact that surprises most people: the original Gospels have no author names in them. None. The titles, according to Matthew, according to Mark, and so on, were added by church leaders in the 2nd century, roughly 100 years after Jesus lived. The Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, one of the most respected biblical references in academic scholarship, confirms that the Gospels were originally anonymous documents. The names were assigned by tradition, not evidence. A man who performed miracles in public, and not a single writer of his era mentioned him. The Roman Empire had historians, philosophers, record keepers. Men like Seneca, Pliny the Elder, Philo of Alexandria, all writing during the exact years Jesus was allegedly performing miracles and drawing massive crowds. None of them mention him. Not once. The references we do have, from Josephus, writing around 93 AD, and Tacitus, writing around 116 AD, were recorded decades after Jesus' death. And the key passage in Josephus, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, is considered by the majority of scholars to have been partially or fully inserted by later Christian scribes. If 4 people witness the same car crash and give 4 completely different stories, at least one of them is wrong. Let's look at the facts. Matthew says Jesus' family fled to Egypt after his birth. Luke says they went straight to Jerusalem and then home to Nazareth. These cannot both be true. Matthew and Luke give completely different genealogies for Jesus, with different ancestors and different numbers of generations. Mark says Jesus was crucified at the 3rd hour, 9 a.m. John says Pilate was still sentencing him at the 6th hour, noon. These aren't minor translation issues. They are direct, factual contradictions between documents that claim to describe the same events. Jesus spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are in Greek. Something got lost in translation, and possibly a lot more. Every serious historian agrees, Jesus and his disciples were Galilean Jews who spoke Aramaic. Yet every Gospel was written in Greek, the language of educated, urban communities far from Galilee. This means the stories passed through at least one language barrier before being written down. Nuance, idiom, and meaning shift in translation. And since we have no Aramaic originals, we have no way to verify what was gained, lost, or changed. These weren't neutral biographies. They were recruitment documents. The Gospels were written for specific communities with specific needs. Scholars have identified their distinct purposes. Mark was written for Romans, emphasizing action and power. Matthew was written for Jews, constantly linking Jesus to Old Testament prophecy. Luke was written for Gentiles, emphasizing inclusivity. John was written to combat early heresies within the church itself. As theologian Raymond, a Catholic priest and leading biblical scholar, acknowledged, the Gospel writers were theologians first, historians second. Their goal was persuasion, not documentation. 3 of the 4 Gospels are essentially rewriting the same document. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they share enormous amounts of content, sometimes word for word. The scholarly consensus, known as the two-source hypothesis, holds that Matthew and Luke both copied from Mark. Both also use the now-lost source scholars called Q, from the German Quelle, meaning source. This means we don't have 4 independent witnesses. We have one primary source, copied and edited by others. In a court of law, that's not 4 testimonies, it's 1. When every detail of a man's life perfectly matches a 700-year-old prophecy, historians get suspicious. Throughout the Gospels, especially Matthew, events in Jesus' life are described specifically to match Old Testament predictions. Born in Bethlehem. Entered Jerusalem on a donkey. Sold for 30 pieces of silver. But here's the problem historians raise: we only have the Gospel author's word that these things happened. There are no independent confirmations. And when a writer knows the prophecy and then writes the biography, the possibility of tailoring the story to fit the script becomes impossible to rule out. Scholar John Shelby Spong, a former bishop and biblical historian, called this practice midrash, a Jewish literary tradition of retelling history through the lens of scripture. Meaningful, yes. Historical record. That's a different question. The stories of Jesus passed by word of mouth for 40 years. What survived? Before a single gospel was written, the stories of Jesus circulated orally, told and retold across communities in Aramaic, then Greek, across Palestine, Syria, Rome, and Egypt. Cognitive psychologists and anthropologists have extensively documented how oral traditions change over time. Details get added. Miracles grow larger. Villains become more evil. Heroes become more divine. The field of form criticism, developed by scholars like Martin and Botman in the early 20th century. Some of the most famous scenes in the Bible weren't in the Bible. Modern textual criticism, the scientific analysis of ancient manuscripts, has found that several prominent gospel passages simply do not appear in the earliest manuscripts we have. Mark 16 verses 9 to 20, the resurrection appearances and the Great Commission, is absent from the oldest manuscript of Mark. Most scholars believe it was added by a later scribe. John 7:53 to 8:11, the story of the woman caught in adultery, with the famous line, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," also does not appear in early manuscripts and is written in a style inconsistent with the rest of John. These conclusions aren't from skeptics. They are from the United Bible Societies and the Nestle-Aland Critical Greek New Testament, the most authoritative textual sources used by biblical scholars worldwide. The single most important event in Christianity has 4 different versions. And they don't agree. The resurrection is the cornerstone of Christian faith. But when you read all 4 accounts side by side, the contradictions are significant. Who went to the tomb? Mark says 3 women. Matthew says 2. John says 1. Who did they see there? Mark says a young man. Luke says 2 men. Matthew says an angel. John says 2 angels. Where did Jesus first appear after rising? Matthew says Galilee. Luke says Jerusalem. Historian Michael Licona, himself an evangelical Christian scholar, wrote an entire book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach, acknowledging these discrepancies and wrestling honestly with them. Even believers admit the accounts don't fully align. The question is simply, what do we do with that? History is complicated. Faith is personal. But the evidence deserves an honest look. If this video made you think, share it with someone who would too. Subscribe for more deep dives into history that doesn't get taught in school. See you in the next one.